Greetings folks, this video is going to be a review of the Makita MAC700 air compressor, and I'm basing this review on my experience having owned this particular compressor for somewhat over 10 years. In this video I'm going to talk about several different areas. One, I want to talk about the general design and build quality of the MAC700 air compressor. Then I'm going to talk about the features I like, things that I would consider pros or reasons to buy the compressor. After that, a couple of small details that I do think could be improved. Then I'm going to talk about air tools that have worked out really well with this air compressor, and which tools simply won't work with this compressor because it's a little bit too small. Finally, before concluding, I'm going to talk about the two compressor accessories that I think everybody should own. And with that, let's get to it. Now, one of the first things you're going to notice about this air compressor is that it is kind of tall, but not very wide. I find the width to be a real advantage, and while it does look like it may be top heavy with a pump and the motor sitting on top of the tank, I've never found that to be the case. In fact, these rubber feet are far enough apart that it's always seemed very stable. Now, one of the things that differentiates the MAC700 air compressor from a lot of other ones is it has a cast iron pump with a large bore cylinder, and it actually turns at about half the RPM of a lot of other air compressors. It's also an oil bath air compressor. The fill is right here, and the window for monitoring whether or not you have enough oil is right here. So you can very easily monitor whether or not the compressor has enough oil in it. Ultimately, what a slower turning pump made out of durable materials like cast iron running in an oil bath, what exactly does that all amount to? Well, what it amounts to is that this compressor is built for longevity and durability. A cast aluminum pump with a smaller piston running at probably twice the rotational speed would more than likely wear out far faster than this thing would. And the other nice thing about all of this is that while it does have a cast iron pump and a fairly good sized motor and a steel tank, it still only weighs in at about 52 pounds. But as far as portable air compressors go, it's not too bad. I've had to schlep this thing up many a staircase, and I can definitely feel the weight, but it's completely manageable. One of my favorite features in this compressor is not something you can see at all. It is quiet. Well, quiet for an air compressor. Makita rates it at 80 decibels. And to put that in context, you could talk over this, but you're going to have to raise your voice. But it is substantially less noisy than a lot of other compressors this size. If you ever found one of those oilless pancake compressors from bargain stores, and you turn them on and they make more noise than a cheap shop vac, that's not like this. And what's more, because it's got a slower pump, the pitch of the noise is actually lower, and so I find it considerably less annoying. And while it is quiet for an air compressor, it's nowhere near as quiet as a purpose-built airbrush compressor that is barely audible. And in fact, if you're looking for a compressor that allows you to paint with an airbrush in an apartment and not tick off the neighbors, this one is quiet, but it's not quite enough for that. Another thing that I like on this compressor is that it came with two gauges. One on the regulator that tells you the pressure your accessories or air tools are operating at, and this one down here on the tank that tells you what your tank pressure is. The tank pressure is almost always going to be higher than the regulated pressure, and being able to monitor them separately is it's a nice convenience. And the machine comes with this quick connector installed. Makita calls this a universal connector, but it is compatible with Milton M-type couplings, which is what I typically use. And the other interesting thing to note, this whole pressure switch regulator quick connector, this whole assembly right here, seems like over a period of years on any air compressor I've seen, it eventually springs a leak somewhere. There are a lot of connections. To the best of my knowledge, none of this, knock wood, none of this leaks. And I've had this compressor for over 10 years, and it has been schlepped around in cars, carried around the shops, stored in a garage. I have not put any soapy water over all these things, but if it's leaking, it's doing it so minimally that you can't hear it at all. It seems like every air compressor I've dealt with, something in this cluster after 2 or 3 years develop a hiss of some sort where there's a leak. Not here. It's kind of amazing, actually. Now we're going to move down to the drain valve here. And the one thing that I really like about this compressor is how easy it is to get at this drain valve. There isn't any of this monkey business where you're feeling around underneath the bottom of the compressor trying to find the tank drain. On this one, you simply lean over, open it up, you're done. The tank drains in seconds. Now, the one other interesting thing about this valve, if you just look at the valve by itself, it almost looks like it's in a really vulnerable position sticking out of the tank like this. Interestingly enough, it's not. Even this handle is within the area that's protected by the legs on either side of it, which form kind of a roll cage for this valve. And so while it is out in the open and easy to get at, it's not nearly as exposed as perhaps it would look simply because the legs are protecting it. And as much as I like this drain valve, it is got one issue that I don't particularly care for, and I'll deal with that later in the video. One other thing that Makita points out in their ads is that it's got what I don't know if they're calling it an intercooler, but it does have these cooling fins. There is a copper pipe that comes out of the pump, runs down along here and goes into the tank, and it's got this kind of a coiled aluminum fin, and it's not fixed on there, that's loose. It does do a surprisingly good job removing a fair amount of heat from the air before it gets into the tank. Now this compressor also has a fairly low power draw. On this tag here, it says 120 volts at 12.4 amps. I don't have any way of measuring the actual draw of this thing when it's operating. In practical terms, what I can tell you is that almost every outlet that I've had to plug this thing into here on any job, because typically I always worked in old houses that had old electrical systems, it was 15 amps at 120 volts, and this thing has not ever popped a breaker unless there was already a large load. It hasn't popped a breaker when it starts up, and it hasn't popped a breaker when it's been running consistently for an extended period of time. It's just not been an issue, so I have to wonder if it's not actually drawing less. But that, however, is not something that I can verify with measurements. One thing that I think is a very distinct advantage to this compressor, and frankly any compressors that are this kind of shape, we always used to call them hot dog compressors because the tank kind of looks like a hot dog, is their narrowness. You can take this thing into some really tight quarters that you're not going to get a lot of other compressors that have a wider profile. If you grab this roll bar, so they call it the roll bar handle, you can grab it here and then like right there, pick it up and hold the thing in front of your chest and go down narrow hallways and up narrow staircases. One of the very first jobs I used this thing on was a house built in the 1920s, and I had to take that up to nail some trim back on after sanding it, and it was not a problem getting this thing up the stairs. I just picked it up, tucked my elbows in, and up that narrow staircase I went. It wasn't a problem. If I had had a bigger compressor, even a pancake compressor, I probably would have bonked into something on the way. But the other thing about this is if you're not carrying it two-handed and you're only grabbing this handle and carrying it with one arm, because the whole weight of this, if you're, say, carrying it in your right arm and you're standing here, the weight of the compressor is not that far off your body. In fact, if you wanted to bring it closer, you could probably just grab it right here. The closer the weight you're carrying is to the center line of your body, the easier something is to carry because you're less off balance. Now, with a compressor that was wider but the same weight, it would actually feel heavier and be harder to move around. The narrowness and weight distribution of a compressor that's this shape is a distinct advantage when you have to start moving it around. Now, one thing that could be improved here is the location of the motor circuit breaker reset, which is right back here. You can barely see it. It's right there. It's behind the hose for the compressed air. And if you have a big hand, you're not going to be able to reach it without pushing it on something. And why they didn't put it over on that side, I have no idea. Maybe they've moved that in newer models. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that this drain valve does have one issue that I'm not 100% thrilled with. Now, it is very easy to get at. It's well protected by the legs. However, it's not on the bottom of the tank, which means if you want to get whatever liquids have collected in the tank out completely, you have to tip the whole compressor up on its side so that that thing is effectively at the bottom. It's not a tremendously big deal. It leans over easily enough, and it's not hard to hold it there, but it is just a little bit of screwing around, and it's another thing you really have to remember to do. What is the Makita MAC700 air compressor ideally suited for? Using it with a tire chuck to inflate car tires, truck tires, tractor tires, bicycle tires, what have you, inner tubes, inflatable water toys, anything like that, it's fantastic. And in fact, its compact size in quickness, in the speed at which you can get it up to pressure is a real advantage because it's going to make the inertia to, I have to get the air compressor out to take care of that, That feeling is a lot lower with this machine simply because it's a lot easier to deal with than, say, a big two-stage compressor that had wheels on the back. It's also very useful for what I would call intermittent use with blowguns. If you have to sit there and blow on something for several minutes in a row, you're going to exhaust the tank and the pump will not be able to keep up with that. A blowgun is basically a controlled leak. If you're looking to use a blowgun to, say, blow dirt out of a lawnmower, in my case, I fixed a vacuum cleaner a few weeks ago, that kind of thing it's very good at. Nailers and staplers of any sort, all the way from a micro pinner and a small upholstery stapler up to a great big framing nailer, this thing, not a problem. The one nice thing about it is that the tank pressure is 130 psi, and most of those tools operate at about 90 psi, and so you do actually have a bigger cushion in the tank than its 2.6 gallon volume would have you believe. If you're looking for an airbrush compressor or a compressor that's capable of running, say, a small, like a mini spray gun, it's good for that too. The only thing you have to watch out for is that because this is an oil bath compressor, you do need some sort of filter between the compressor and your spray rigs to make sure that it's taking all the oil and moisture out of the air. What is this compressor not practical to use with? For starters, impact wrenches, especially bigger ones, half-inch drive or larger. Air sanders of any sort. They usually use a tremendous amount of air and usually at high operating pressures. This compressor is also not effective at running sandblasters. Sandblasters are not tremendously different than blowguns. They're basically just a big leak, except a sandblaster has some way of actually drawing abrasive into the airstream. And lastly, full-size spray guns. You might be able to spray small areas with a full-size spray gun with this because you would be running off the tank, but generally speaking, if you're spraying something large, a large spray gun will exhaust the air in the tank and the pump doesn't have enough output to keep up with that. You know, the way to figure out if your spray gun is actually going to work is simply look at how many cubic feet a minute is that thing going to consume versus what this air compressor or any other air compressor you're looking at able to produce. This one is 3.3 CFM at 90 psi, and a lot of spray guns, they're going to go through more than that. They might be operating at a lower pressure, but this thing isn't going to produce a tremendously larger volume than that, even at a lower pressure. Now, all the tools that are either impractical or impossible to run with this compressor have nothing to do with the quality of the compressor. It simply isn't that big. Now, whether or not you decide the MAC700 is or isn't the compressor for you, there are a couple of things that I think everybody should have. One of them is a polyurethane air hose. And yeah, polyurethane. Not PVC, not EPDM, not rubber, not anything else, polyurethane. They're smaller, they're lighter, they're stronger, they're more abrasion resistant. You know, if you kink it like this, it just goes right back to where it was. If you get them tangled up, they're easier to get untangled. Believe it or not, this is a 50-foot air hose. They're just a drastic improvement over anything else. The only thing they don't have going for them is price. They are expensive. In fact, it's probably the most expensive air hose I've ever seen, but it's worth every single penny. The other accessory I think everybody who uses compressed air or owns an air compressor should have is one of these swivels. It actually has two directions of motion, like this, and then this piece turns like this. Those two swivels will allow you to keep the air hose out of your way, regardless of what angle you're using the air tool at. You know, it's one of those things that may not seem like a big deal until you've tried it, and once you've tried it, you really can't live without it. They're not very expensive. Any of you who are looking for a good all-around air compressor will not regret buying this one. I certainly haven't, and in fact, I expect it to be my primary air compressor for many years to come. Thank you very much for hanging out all this time and hearing what I have to say about the Makita MAC700. While you're here, if you could, please watch another video all the way through and subscribe to my channel. Both those things help the channel grow, and I do appreciate them. So goodbye for now, and I'll see you in another video.